Story number 1.
I had never been afraid of the dark. Growing up in a small town, I learned to appreciate the quiet solitude that night brought. But that all changed during a winter night in 2017. It started as an ordinary evening. I had moved into a small, old house on the outskirts of town a few months earlier. The house was cheap, had character, and a history that intrigued me. The previous owners had left in a hurry, and rumors about the place were as old as the house itself. Some people said it was haunted, but I brushed it off as small-town superstition. After all, I wasn't one to believe in ghosts. It was around midnight when things began to shift. I had just finished watching a late-night movie and was about to head to bed. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. My eyes darted to the hallway outside my bedroom door, where the faint light of the street lamp outside cast long shadows. It looked normal, but there was something about the silence that felt off. I couldn't explain it, but I brushed the feeling aside and turned off the light, crawling under the covers. But I couldn't sleep. The air felt heavy and my mind raced with unease. I told myself it was just the cold night air, that I was being ridiculous. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the feeling. And then I heard it. At first, it was a faint sound, barely noticeable. A creak, like the floorboards groaning under the weight of footsteps. I held my breath, straining to hear, but the noise stopped. I convinced myself it was just the house settling. An old wooden house like mine had a lot of that. But then it came again, louder this time. A deliberate, slow step. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was in the house. I sat up in bed, my hands trembling as I listened. The footsteps continued, moving closer, as if someone was walking down the hallway toward my room. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The air felt colder, and I realized my breath was coming out in short, panicked bursts. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. I should have grabbed my phone, called someone, but I was frozen, my eyes locked on the shadows that danced under the doorframe. The house was old, and the sounds it made in the night were well known to me, until this moment. This was different. This wasn't the usual creaking and groaning of a house in the cold. This was deliberate. This was real. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a soft whisper. "Help me." The voice was so faint, so hollow that it barely registered at first. I strained my ears, my pulse pounding in my chest. I could barely comprehend it, but there was no mistaking the pleading tone. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. My body refused to move. My mind raced through 1,000 thoughts. Was it a dream? Was I imagining it? No, this was happening. I mustered every ounce of courage and slowly stood up, my feet cold against the wooden floor. My hands shook as I reached for the doorknob. The air around me was thick with an unexplainable pressure, like the walls themselves were closing in. I could feel the whisper vibrating through my bones. The door creaked open and I peered into the hallway. Empty. But I wasn't alone. I stepped out of my room, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I turned to my left, where the staircase led down to the darkened first floor. The hallway was dimly lit by the faint glow of the street lamp outside, but it didn't feel right. The air was so cold it felt like ice, and the shadows stretched unnaturally long. It was as if the darkness itself was waiting, watching. I moved cautiously toward the stairs, the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. The whisper came again, closer this time, but this time it was louder, clearer. "Please." I froze. The voice sounded desperate, broken. It didn't belong in my house. It didn't belong anywhere. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to leave, to get out of there. But my feet carried me forward, down the stairs. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I noticed something. The living room was dark, but the fireplace, which I had not lit in days, flickered with a faint, unnatural light. And there, in the corner of the room, stood a figure. A shadow. It wasn't quite human, but it was shaped like one. I couldn't make out details at first, only that it was tall enough that its head almost brushed the ceiling. Its form was shifting, like smoke or mist, but darker. So dark that the space around it seemed to bend and distort. I couldn't move. My legs were like stone, rooted to the floor as I stared at the figure. It tilted its head, and for a brief moment I thought I saw eyes. Dark, empty eyes that seemed to peer into the very depths of my soul. Then it spoke. "Don't leave me." The voice was guttural, like the sound of something long forgotten, something that had been lost to time. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. It wasn't just a ghost. It was something worse, something that had been waiting for a long time. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind screamed at me to get out of the house, to run, to never look back. But the figure seemed to reach out to me, its form stretching toward me like a hand made of shadows. I turned and fled up the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps as I sprinted back to my room. The door slammed behind me, and I locked it with trembling hands. My back pressed against the door, my breath ragged as I stared at the darkened room. I could hear it now, the soft whisper, repeating itself over and over again. "Help me. Please." The house had gone deathly silent, but I knew it was still there, waiting, lurking just outside my door. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure standing in the living room, its empty eyes staring back at me. I left the next morning, packed up my things, and never returned. The house was abandoned again, left to rot just as it had before I moved in. The town talked about the strange happenings in the old house, but no one really knew what had happened there. No one really wanted to know. To this day, I wonder who or what that figure was. What did it want from me? Why did it beg for help? I don't know, and I don't care to find out. Some things are better left alone, buried in the shadows where they belong. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was a rainy night in late October of 2019 when I found myself alone in the old farmhouse. I had been living in a small town for a while, having recently moved in with my uncle after my parents passed away. The farmhouse had been in our family for generations, a quiet, secluded place nestled at the edge of a dense forest. The house itself was charming in its own way, but there was something about it that felt off. It wasn't anything I could point to, just a vague sense of unease that followed me, especially at night. I had been alone in the house for a couple of days while my uncle was away on a trip. The rain had begun to fall heavily around dusk, and by the time night arrived, the winds had picked up, howling through the trees. The house creaked and groaned with every gust of wind, the walls shaking slightly as if they were struggling to hold themselves together. The lights flickered now and then, adding to the eerie atmosphere. Still, I tried to ignore it. I wasn't new to this house, and I had always found it oddly peaceful, until that night. I was sitting in the living room, trying to focus on a book, when the power cut out completely. The sudden darkness felt suffocating. I stood up, fumbling for my phone to use its flashlight. I knew the house had an old generator, but it always took a while to kick in. I had hoped it would start soon, but it didn't. So, I decided to go to the kitchen to fetch some candles. The house was silent, save for the occasional sound of the storm outside. As I passed through the hallway, I noticed the faint scent of something old, wood and dust, mixed with the faint, pungent scent of mothballs. The hallway light was out, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I reached the stairs. The stairs led to the second floor, where the bedrooms were located, and the thought of walking up there in the pitch darkness made my stomach twist. Still, I had no choice. I could hear the rain pelting against the roof, the wind howling as it rattled the windows. I climbed the stairs slowly, holding onto the railing with a tight grip. The house creaked beneath my feet as I moved, the wood protesting under my weight. At the top of the stairs, I turned toward the bathroom. That was when I first heard it, a soft whisper, just faint enough that I wasn't sure I had heard anything at all. I froze. The whisper came again, this time louder, more distinct. It was a woman's voice, but it wasn't quite right. The words were unintelligible, like they were being muffled through a thick fog. "Hello?" I called out into the darkness, my voice shaking more than I intended. There was no answer, but the whispering continued, drifting in and out of hearing range. I glanced nervously down the hallway, but there was no one there. Feeling more unnerved than I had ever been before, I quickly grabbed a few candles from the bathroom, lit them with a match, and headed back downstairs. The house seemed quieter now, but the oppressive feeling of being watched lingered in the air. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, the storm playing tricks on me. But then came the knock. It was a loud, solid knock that came from the front door. 3 sharp raps. My heart skipped a beat and my body froze. Who could be at the door at this hour, in the middle of a storm? I didn't move for several moments, debating whether I should check it out. The rational part of my brain told me to wait, to stay away from the door. But curiosity got the better of me. I set the candles down on the coffee table and approached the door cautiously. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No one answered. The wind outside howled louder, and the rain splattered against the windows. I peered through the small peephole, but I couldn't see anything. The porch was empty. My stomach twisted with unease. I didn't know why, but I felt like I was being drawn into something I wasn't supposed to understand. I slowly opened the door, and to my surprise, no one was there. I stepped outside, the cold rain immediately soaking through my clothes, but there was no sign of anyone, no footsteps in the mud, nothing. I stood there for a moment, looking around the property. The barn was at the far side of the yard, the trees swaying violently in the wind, but everything appeared still and untouched. It was as if the knock had been nothing more than an illusion. I closed the door behind me and locked it, my hands trembling. As I turned around, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from my uncle. "Everything okay? Just wanted to check in." I quickly typed back, telling him about the strange knock. He replied almost immediately. "Don't worry about it. The house has been around for a long time. It plays tricks on you sometimes. Just go to bed, and you'll be fine." I wasn't sure if his words were meant to comfort me or make me feel foolish. I stood there in the living room, staring at the door for a long moment before I finally decided to go upstairs to bed. My legs were heavy as I ascended the stairs again, my eyes darting to every corner of the house. It felt as though the walls were watching me, the shadows longer than they should have been. I finally reached my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I climbed into bed, pulling the covers tightly around me. The wind outside had picked up again, and the house groaned as it was battered by the storm. But the whispering was still there. It was soft at first, so faint that I thought it might be the wind, but as I lay there, it grew louder, clearer. The voice was closer now, almost as if it was standing beside my bed. "Help me." The words sent a cold shiver down my spine. The whisper was no longer muffled, no longer indistinct. It was pleading, desperate, as if something was begging for help. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I sat up in bed. I turned on my phone's flashlight and scanned the room, but there was nothing. No one. The room was empty. The whispering didn't stop. It was louder now, more insistent. "Help me." I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I unlocked it. I stepped into the hallway, the house silent now except for the rain. But the whispering didn't stop. It followed me, echoing in the darkness, coming from the end of the hallway where the attic door stood. I could feel something pulling me toward it. My feet moved of their own accord, carrying me toward the stairs leading up to the attic. The door at the top of the stairs was old and weathered, its wooden frame warped by years of exposure to the elements. But the whispering was stronger now, almost suffocating, a voice that seemed to fill the entire house. As I reached the top of the stairs, the air grew colder. I hesitated for a moment, but then with a final involuntary step, I pushed open the attic door. The room inside was dark, dust and cobwebs hanging from the rafters, but in the far corner, there was a figure, a woman, standing motionless. Her back was to me, and her long hair cascaded down her back in a tangled mess. She was dressed in an old-fashioned gown, the kind you'd expect from a century ago. "Please," the voice came from her, faint but clear. "Help me." Before I could respond, the woman turned to face me. Her face was pale, gaunt, her eyes hollow and empty. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Instead, a cold wind surged through the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I tried to scream, but no sound came. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I had always considered myself a rational person, one who didn't easily fall for ghost stories or urban legends. But everything changed on that cold November night in 2018. I was living alone in an old apartment building in the city, one of those places that had seen better days, but still offered affordable rent. The building had a strange history. Something about it being built on an old burial ground or used as a hospital during some long-forgotten epidemic. I didn't pay much attention to the rumors. The place was cheap. The location was perfect. and it didn't bother me that much that the hallway lights flickered from time to time, or that the elevator sometimes groaned when it moved. That night, the wind was especially harsh, the kind of wind that makes the windows rattle in their frames. The rain came down in sheets, slashing against the glass and flooding the streets outside. The city was quieter than usual, as if the weather had pushed everyone indoors. I was alone in my apartment, curled up on the couch with a book, trying to relax. My phone was charging on the coffee table, and my cat, Oliver, was curled up beside me, purring softly. I was about to turn a page when I heard a soft knock. It was faint, almost as if someone were tapping gently on the other side of the door. I paused, staring at the door for a moment, unsure if I had imagined it. It wasn't uncommon for someone to knock in the building, usually neighbors asking to borrow something or offering me leftovers, but it was nearly 11 p.m., and I wasn't expecting anyone. I stood up slowly, moving toward the door. I peered through the peephole, but saw nothing. Just the dimly lit hallway stretching into darkness. I was about to turn away when I heard the knock again, this time a little louder, more insistent. "Hello," I called out, though my voice wavered slightly. "Who's there?" No response. My mind started to race. Maybe it was a prank, or someone had the wrong apartment. Still, I couldn't shake the odd feeling creeping up my spine. My hand hovered over the door handle, but I hesitated. I didn't want to open it if it was some drunk neighbor or worse, a stranger who had mistakenly found my apartment in the dark hallway. Just as I was about to step back, I heard the whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the storm outside, but then it grew louder, more distinct. It was a woman's voice, soft, almost pleading. "Let me in." The words chilled me to my core. My heart started pounding in my chest. I was frozen, not knowing what to do. I thought about calling the building manager or even the police, but the voice, it felt wrong. It wasn't a normal request. It was almost as if it was a command. It wasn't until the sound of the knock came again, this time much louder, that I snapped out of my stupor. "Let me in," the voice called again, more urgently now. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. This wasn't normal. This wasn't a prank. I knew that. I tried to gather myself, to remind myself that I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits or any of that nonsense, but the growing sense of unease had me shaking. I couldn't stand it anymore. I turned the lock and yanked the door open, expecting to find some idiot with too much time on their hands. But there was no one. No one in the hallway, no one outside my door. Just the dim glow from the flickering overhead light. I stepped into the hallway cautiously, my pulse pounding in my ears. The hallway stretched long and empty in both directions, no sign of movement. The silence was overwhelming, as if the storm outside had muted the entire building. I glanced at the end of the hall, where a faint light from the stairwell barely illuminated the corner. Nothing seemed out of place. Then I heard it again. This time it was closer. The voice was unmistakable, just behind me, as though it had traveled from the other side of the door to now stand right behind me. "Let me in." I whipped around so fast I almost stumbled, but again, there was nothing. No one. My apartment was at the far end of the hallway, away from the main staircase, so there was no reason for anyone to be here, especially this late at night. I was certain no one had entered the building recently. My heart was racing and my palms were sweaty. That's when I noticed something. At the far end of the hallway, just beyond the dim light, a shadow moved. It was subtle, almost like a trick of the light, but I knew it wasn't my imagination. The shadow was humanoid in shape, standing perfectly still. I could barely make out the figure, but I could feel its presence. Something dark, something wrong. I was frozen. My body refused to move, as though it was too afraid to even take a step forward. I stared at the shadow for what felt like an eternity. My eyes locked on it. Then slowly it moved. The figure shifted, not in a natural way, but like something gliding across the floor, its movements jerky and unnatural. I was about to turn and run back to my apartment when I heard the whisper again, this time coming from directly behind me. "Help me!" I whirled around, but once again the hallway was empty. My breath hitched in my throat. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest. I was on the verge of panic, every instinct in me screaming to get out of the building, to flee, but my legs felt like lead. The voice, the shadow, the strange whispers, they were all starting to overwhelm me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. that I was being watched. I backed slowly into my apartment, closing the door behind me with a shaking hand. My cat, Oliver, was no longer curled up on the couch. He was pacing nervously, his tail flicking in agitation. I didn't take my eyes off the door, half expecting to see a shadow slide under it. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind, that the stress of being alone was getting to me, but something told me it wasn't. The hours that followed were the longest of my life. The wind outside had only picked up, the rain now slashing against the windows with a deafening roar. The whispers had stopped, but every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear that voice. "Let me in," echoing in my mind. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind felt like it was a warning. I stayed awake the entire night, the fear gnawing at me. By morning, when the first light of dawn filtered through the blinds, I felt almost as if I had imagined the entire experience. But when I went to check my phone for the time, I saw a notification that made my blood run cold. It was a message from the building manager. "Just wanted to let you know that the previous tenant in your apartment passed away about a year ago. She had been in a car accident, and no one ever found out what happened to her. I always thought she might still be here." The message ended with a simple, chilling line. "Let me know if you need anything." I never went back to that apartment. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was late December of 2017 when I moved into the small, run-down apartment in the middle of the city. The rent was cheap, and for a young professional like me, that was the most important factor. The building itself had been around for decades, and though the landlord assured me it had been recently renovated, I could still see traces of its old age. The faded wallpaper, the squeaky floorboards, the odd smell that lingered in the halls. All of these things gave the place a certain charm, but also an undeniable sense of discomfort. But at the time, I didn't really care. I had a job to focus on and a life to rebuild after a tough breakup, so I didn't think too much about the little details that others might consider odd. For the first couple of nights, everything seemed fine. The neighbors were quiet, the city noise barely seeped through the walls, and I had everything I needed. The apartment was small but cozy. It was a one-bedroom, just big enough for a bed, a couch, and a small kitchen. Perfect for a single person. But then, on the fourth night, everything changed. It was around 11:30 p.m. and I had just finished watching a movie on Netflix. I had been feeling a little on edge that evening for no apparent reason. Maybe it was the quiet, maybe it was just my mind wandering after the long day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just tired, and decided to go to bed. The moment I lay down, however, the atmosphere in the apartment seemed to shift. The room felt heavier, almost oppressive. It wasn't just the usual silence that settled in after dark. There was something else, something I couldn't quite explain. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation, but all I could think about was the strange sensation of being watched. I closed my eyes, trying to push the feeling away, and almost immediately heard a faint noise coming from the hallway outside my bedroom door. It was a soft shuffle, like someone dragging their feet across the carpet. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I waited for a moment, listening intently, but then the sound stopped and the silence returned. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a neighbor had come home late. Maybe it was the building settling, creaking in the cold night. I tried to dismiss it, but as I lay there in the darkness, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. There was something strange in the air, an energy I couldn't explain. Then, just as I was starting to drift off to sleep, I heard it again, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It was too soft to make out any words, but it was definitely there, as a voice murmuring from somewhere in the apartment. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up in bed, wide awake. The apartment was still. I couldn't hear anything else. But the whisper, it was as though it was coming from right next to me. I glanced around the room, scanning every corner. Nothing. I shook my head, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to push the strange experience to the back of my mind, chalking it up to stress or perhaps a bad reaction to the medication I'd recently started taking. But every night, the feeling of being watched lingered. The whispering would come and go, sometimes just a murmur, sometimes a voice so clear it almost sounded like someone was standing beside my bed. By the third night, I had enough. I decided to stay up late and try to get to the bottom of whatever was going on. I positioned myself in the living room with a book, trying to keep my mind distracted. I made sure the apartment was locked up tight and I didn't want to entertain any more thoughts of strange noises or voices. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard it again. This time it was louder, clearer, a woman's voice. It wasn't a whisper anymore. The words were unmistakable. "Help me." I froze. My blood ran cold. The voice sounded so real, so desperate. I immediately stood up and checked every room, convinced someone had broken in. But when I opened the bedroom door, there was nothing there. No intruder, no sign of anyone having been there. I checked the windows, the closets, even the bathroom. Nothing. It was just me in the apartment, alone, but the feeling of dread hung thick in the air. I thought about calling the police, but I couldn't explain what had happened. Who would believe me? Who would believe that the voice had come from nowhere, out of thin air? But as I was about to close the bedroom door, I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow in the corner of the room. But then, slowly, it began to take shape, a figure hunched over as if it were crouching in the darkness. The figure was barely visible, just a silhouette against the dim light from the hallway. I couldn't make out any details, but the shape seemed unmistakable. A person. A woman, her head hanging low, as if in despair. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But before I could react, the figure moved, slowly, dragging itself toward me. It wasn't walking, it was more like crawling, its limbs contorting unnaturally. The sound of its movements was sickening, like bones grinding together. The figure raised its head, and I saw it. A pale, gaunt face, eyes wide open but completely lifeless. The skin was stretched tight across its face, as if it had been starved of all life. The room seemed to grow colder, and I felt my body freeze in place. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to look away as the figure came closer and closer, inch by inch. "Help me," the voice whispered again, only now it was clear and unmistakable. I bolted from the room, running down the hallway to the front door. I fumbled for my keys, trying desperately to get outside, to escape the horror that was unfolding behind me. But just as I grabbed the door handle, I heard the whisper again, only this time it wasn't coming from behind me. It was coming from right in front of me, from the darkness just outside the door. The same voice, desperate, pleading. "Help me." I couldn't take it anymore. I threw the door open and ran out into the cold night, not looking back. I didn't care about the building or the apartment anymore. I needed to get away to escape the feeling that had consumed me. I stayed with a friend that night, too scared to return to the apartment. The next morning, I called the landlord and told him I was moving out. I couldn't stay there any longer, not after what I had seen and heard. When I told the landlord about the voice, about the figure in the bedroom, he didn't seem surprised. He just nodded and said, "There's a history to that apartment. Some things can't be explained." I never went back to that building. I moved to a different place, a quiet neighborhood where I could sleep without hearing whispers in the dark. But even now, years later, I can still hear that voice sometimes, in the quiet moments when I'm alone. I don't know who it was or what it wanted, but I do know one thing. I will never forget that night. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I was living alone in a small 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet suburban neighborhood, and despite the usual noises of the city outside, I felt at peace. I had just moved into the place 6 months ago, and everything seemed fine. No strange sounds, no odd occurrences, just the usual creaks and groans of an old building. But there was something about this particular night that was different, something I couldn't shake. It was the beginning of October 2019, and I had just returned home from work, exhausted after a long day. The apartment was still warm from the afternoon sun, and I decided to take it easy for the evening. I made some tea, curled up on the couch, and watched a few episodes of a show before heading to bed. The night was calm, almost too calm. The air was thick with a strange, uncomfortable silence. As I made my way to the bathroom to brush my teeth, I couldn't help but notice how still everything was. My cat, Moxie, was usually darting around, demanding attention, but tonight she was nowhere to be found. I checked the corners of the room, the windows, and even under the couch. Nothing. I shrugged it off. Cats do that sometimes. But as I made my way back to the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence, the stillness, it was unsettling. When I got back to the couch, I sat down and grabbed my phone to scroll through social media. The apartment was dimly lit, with just the glow of the lamp next to the couch. It was then that I heard the softest, faintest sound, a scratching noise, like something was lightly dragging across the floor. I froze. It was coming from the hallway outside my bedroom just past the door. At first, I thought it was Moxie, but the sound wasn't right. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. My cat was quiet, especially when I was at home. She never scratched like that. I stood up cautiously, my heart rate picking up. I moved toward the hallway and peered around the corner, my breath catching in my throat as I scanned the empty space. There was nothing there. The hallway was dark, save for the faint light from the living room. I felt stupid, but the feeling of unease hadn't subsided. I returned to the couch and tried to focus on the TV, but the scratching noise continued, louder this time, as if it were coming from just behind me. I turned around quickly, half expecting to find Moxie behind me, but again, there was nothing. My mind was playing tricks on me, I thought. Maybe it was just the house settling. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the irrational fear creeping up my spine. But then the scratching came again, this time louder and closer, from right behind me. I whipped around, heart racing. Still, nothing. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible voice, just barely audible. "Help me." I froze, my blood running cold. It was a whisper, so faint it was like it was coming from the walls themselves. My instincts screamed at me to leave the apartment, but I couldn't move. The voice had come from behind me, from the direction of my bedroom. I got up slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last. The hallway seemed longer now, the darkness stretching out unnaturally. I approached the bedroom door, and as my hand reached for the handle, I hesitated. I don't know why, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. With a shaky breath, I opened the door and stepped inside. The bedroom was dark, save for the glow from the streetlights outside filtering through the curtains. The bed was unmade, the room untouched, but something felt off. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. Moving. I turned quickly, but the shadow disappeared into the corner of the room, vanishing into the darkness as if it had never been there. I blinked, unsure if I had imagined it, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breathing was shallow. "Moxie?" I called out, my voice trembling. But she didn't answer. She was still nowhere to be found. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in the room with me. I looked around, but nothing seemed out of place. The closet door was closed, and the windows were locked. Yet the air felt charged with a presence, a malevolent force just beyond my reach. I turned to leave the room, but that's when I heard it again. This time, clearer. The voice, pleading, desperate. "Help me." I spun around, but again, I saw nothing, no one. The room was empty, but the voice, it was unmistakable. I could hear it, feel it, resonating in my chest. It wasn't coming from any one direction. It was coming from all around me. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the light switch, flipping it on, but the room stayed dark. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone, trying to get a signal, trying to do something to break the terror that was overtaking me. But my phone flickered and died, the screen going black despite the full battery. "Help me," the voice repeated. It was louder now, closer, like it was right next to my ear. I screamed. The sound of it echoed in the empty apartment. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me, and rushed back to the living room, my heart racing in my chest. But the apartment was still. Silent. I called my friend Sarah, my voice panicked, my words barely making sense. She answered groggily, not understanding what I was saying, but I begged her to come over, to just stay with me for a while. I needed someone. Anyone. She agreed, though I could hear the concern in her voice. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said, and though I knew she'd arrive soon, the seconds felt like hours. The air was still thick, and I could feel the presence of something watching me. The scraping noise started again, louder now. It was coming from the hallway again, right outside my bedroom door. "Please stop," I whispered to the empty space. And then it stopped, just like that. The silence was overwhelming. It hung in the air, pressing down on me like a weight. I sat in the living room, waiting for Sarah to arrive, but every minute felt like an eternity. I kept checking the hallway, expecting to see something, someone, but there was nothing. When Sarah arrived, I told her everything. She was skeptical, of course. She reassured me that it was probably just stress or my imagination playing tricks on me. But I knew what I had heard, what I had felt. I knew I wasn't crazy. That night, we stayed up late, talking and trying to keep my mind off the fear. Eventually, I fell asleep on the couch and Sarah stayed in the bedroom, but the atmosphere never fully cleared. The sense of dread lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting. The next morning, Sarah left early for work, and I decided to return to the bedroom, determined to get some sleep in my own bed. As I stepped inside, I froze. There, on the floor, just next to the door, was a single deep scratch mark, like something had been dragged across the wood. I didn't know what to make of it. I didn't want to know. That afternoon, I called the landlord to ask if there was anything unusual about the apartment, any history I should be aware of. She was quiet for a moment before responding. "There have been a few things, I suppose," she said. "Some people have mentioned hearing noises or feeling uncomfortable. The last tenant, she moved out rather suddenly." That was all she said, and I didn't press her further. I never stayed another night in that apartment. A week later, I packed up my things and moved out. I didn't feel comfortable staying there anymore. Not with the scratches, the voice, the feeling of being watched. And even now, sometimes when I'm alone in the quiet of my new place, I can still hear that voice, soft and distant, pleading for help. It's as if the apartment I left behind still holds something, some presence, that refuses to let go. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It was late summer, August of 2018, when I moved into the apartment. It was a modest place, nothing special, but it was perfect for someone just starting out like me. I had recently graduated and landed a job in the city, so I needed somewhere to stay that was within my budget. The apartment was on the second floor of an old building, with worn-out floors and cracked paint on the walls. The landlord, a middle-aged man who seemed a bit too eager to get me to sign the lease, warned me that the building was a little quirky. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was cheap, and I needed a place to live. The first few nights were peaceful. I unpacked my things and settled into my new routine, work during the day, some light reading in the evenings, and a decent amount of sleep. Nothing strange happened during that time, but then, on the fourth night, something happened that would change everything. It started innocently enough. I was sitting on my couch watching a movie when I heard a faint noise coming from the hallway. It sounded like a soft scraping, almost like something was being dragged across the floor. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, an old apartment with creaky floors. But then the sound came again. It was closer this time, almost as if it was coming from just outside my door. I paused the movie and listened carefully, my heart pounding slightly as I strained to hear. It was too rhythmic to be a normal creak, too deliberate. The scraping sound continued for a few more seconds before it stopped altogether. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe one of the neighbors was moving furniture or something. I went back to the movie, but the feeling of unease lingered. It was a quiet night, and the air felt heavy. I couldn't get rid of the nagging sensation that I wasn't alone, even though I knew for a fact that the building was empty except for me. About an hour later, I decided to head to bed. The hall light flickered slightly as I made my way down the corridor, the old bulbs buzzing in their sockets. I opened the door to my bedroom and froze. For a moment, I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. The bed was made, as it should be, but there was a faint impression on the blankets, like someone had lain down for a moment but had quickly gotten up. The sheets were slightly disturbed, and a small dent in the pillow suggested a head had recently rested there. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I hadn't touched the bed in hours. I checked the apartment again. The closet was empty, the bathroom door was shut, and the windows were locked. But as I looked back at the bed, the sensation of being watched returned, even stronger now. It was as if something unseen was in the room with me, hovering just behind me. I tried to shake it off, rationalizing that maybe I had left the sheets a little uneven when I made the bed earlier, but my mind kept going back to that strange impression, the feeling that someone, or something, had been there. I decided to sleep with the light on that night, though I didn't want to admit why. The feeling of dread had settled deep in my chest, and I couldn't shake it. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing as I waited for sleep to come. But the silence in the apartment felt suffocating, almost oppressive. Every small sound, the hum of the fridge, the creak of the floorboards outside the bedroom door, felt amplified in the dark. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a restless sleep. I woke up at exactly 3:14 a.m. The apartment was unnaturally still, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I sat up in bed, listening. There was no sound, no hum of the refrigerator, no creak of the building settling, only a deep, unsettling quiet. Then I heard it, a whisper. It was faint but distinct. Hello. The voice sounded distant, as if coming from the other side of the room, but there was no one there. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The whisper came again, this time a little louder, clearer. Help! I couldn't breathe. I felt paralyzed, as though my body had turned to stone. The whispering continued, soft and pleading. I tried to move to get out of bed, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I felt trapped in the bed, as though the very room itself was holding me there. The whispers grew more frantic. Please, help me, please. And then just as suddenly as it had started, the whispers stopped. The room fell back into complete silence. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation. Maybe I had dreamed it. Maybe it was a sound from outside, or even my neighbor through the thin walls. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I managed to get out of bed and turn on the light. My hands were shaking as I checked every corner of the room, the closet, the bathroom, and even under the bed. There was nothing. Nothing but the silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed awake, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner of the apartment, waiting for the whispering to start again. But it didn't. The hours dragged on, and eventually the first rays of morning sunlight crept through the window, filling the room with a pale, cold light. I was exhausted, but there was no way I was going back to sleep. The next few days passed uneventfully. I chalked up the strange occurrences to stress or my mind playing tricks on me. But as the days wore on, the odd events began to intensify. Every night I would hear the same faint scratching sound from the hallway. Every night I would feel the weight of the room pressing in on me. And every night as I lay in bed, I would hear the whispering. Help me. I had no idea what was happening, but I was terrified. I started to question my sanity, but deep down I knew I wasn't imagining it. There was something in the apartment, something that wanted something from me. One evening, I decided to confront it. I gathered my courage, made sure all the lights were on, and sat in the living room, waiting. Hours passed, but nothing happened. No scraping, no whispering, no strange impressions on the bed. I felt foolish for letting my fear take over, but then, at exactly 2:47 a.m., it started again. The whispering, soft at first, then louder, more desperate. Help me. It was as if the voice was coming from the very walls themselves. I could feel it in my bones, this deep, unshakable fear. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things and left the apartment that night. I didn't even bother to tell the landlord. I just couldn't stay there any longer. The next day, I moved in with a friend, and I never looked back. I later found out that the apartment had a long history of strange occurrences. The building itself was over 100 years old, and previous tenants had complained of hearing strange noises, seeing shadows, and feeling a presence in their homes. One tenant had even reported waking up to find the bed sheets disturbed, as though someone had been lying next to them, but none of them had ever stayed long enough to figure out what was going on. I never returned to that apartment. I don't think I ever will, but to this day, when I'm alone at night, I still hear that whisper, soft and distant. Help me. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was the fall of 2017 when I first moved into the apartment on the third floor of an old brick building in the city. I had just finished university and, like most graduates, was starting my new job and trying to get my life together. The building was older, and its history was a bit of a mystery to everyone. The landlord didn't have much to say about it, except that the apartment was available because the previous tenant had suddenly left. The apartment itself wasn't anything special. It was a one-bedroom with hardwood floors that creaked under my weight. There was an old radiator in the corner, and the kitchen had that vintage 1970s feel with its avocado green cabinets and a small fridge. I wasn't expecting luxury, but it was perfect for me at the time. And as the days went on, I became comfortable in my new space. However, the first time I felt something was off was during the second week I lived there. I had just returned from work around 10:30 p.m. I had been exhausted and went straight to bed, telling myself that I'd tackle the unpacking tomorrow. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional noise from the radiator heating up. I climbed into bed, and almost immediately, the silence of the apartment enveloped me. I didn't think much of it at first. I was adjusting to my new life and the sounds of the city outside my window. But there was one sound I started hearing late at night. It was faint at first, so I dismissed it. It sounded like light scratching, like someone dragging their fingernails across the wall. At first I thought it was just the old building settling, maybe the pipes or the structure shifting. But as the days went on, the scratching grew louder. It was as if someone was pacing back and forth in the room beside mine, just out of my view. I would wake up in the middle of the night, disoriented, heart pounding, but when I listened carefully, the noise was still there. It didn't happen every night, but when it did, I couldn't ignore it. The first few times I heard it, I'd check the apartment, thinking maybe it was the neighbors, but I never found anyone. The feeling that something wasn't quite right grew stronger. I remember lying in bed one night, unable to sleep, when I heard something new. It was a soft thud, like something heavy was dropped on the floor, but nothing had fallen. The thud repeated, this time louder. My heart raced, and my mind began to spiral. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid, but the noises persisted. Around this time, I noticed another odd thing. My cat, Jasper, who had always been a quiet, independent animal, began acting strange. Normally, he would sleep soundly at the foot of my bed, but for the past few nights, he had been restless. He would stare at the hallway door for hours, his body rigid, his eyes wide, as if he was watching something, or someone. One particular night, I couldn't stand the feeling any longer. The scratching was louder than usual, and my cat was acting so strangely that I finally decided to confront it. I stood up from my bed, took a deep breath, and slowly walked to the hallway. I expected to find some logical explanation, perhaps a loose pipe or a neighbor's noise, but when I looked down the hall, I felt a chill run through me. The hallway was dark, and there was no sound, nothing out of place at all. But just as I was about to turn back to my room, I felt it. A cold breeze. It was coming from the bathroom at the end of the hallway, where the door was slightly ajar. My skin crawled. The temperature in the apartment had dropped so suddenly that it was almost unbearable. I approached the bathroom door, heart racing, and as I pushed it open, a low, hollow noise filled the air. It sounded like breathing. Slow, heavy, labored breathing. I stepped back quickly and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. I felt like I was suffocating. I bolted back to my room, slammed the door, and turned on every light I could find, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. After that night, things only got worse. The noises didn't stop. The scratching became a constant presence, as if it were following me, echoing in the walls. I started waking up every night at the same time, around 3 a.m. I'd lie in bed, frozen, listening to the faint scraping noise that now seemed to surround me. The worst part was that the whispers began. At first it was faint, just an indistinct murmur that I couldn't quite make out. But as the days passed, the whispers became clearer. They were always the same, soft, almost like someone speaking directly into my ear. Sometimes it sounded like a man's voice, sometimes a woman's, but the words were always the same. Help, help me. It felt like they were coming from inside the apartment, from the walls, from the very air around me. My cat, Jasper, refused to enter my bedroom anymore. He would scratch at the door to get out, his fur standing on end, and I knew something was wrong. I tried to ignore it at first, but the feeling of dread that had taken over the apartment began to consume me. I eventually reached out to the building manager. I had to know what was happening. Maybe there was something I was missing. When I told him about the noises and the strange experiences, he hesitated for a long time before finally saying, "You're not the first person to have those kinds of experiences in that apartment." He explained that the building had a long history and several tenants had reported similar occurrences. A few had even moved out early. "The apartment has a reputation," he added cryptically. "Some say it's just old, but others think it's haunted." I asked him for more details, but he wouldn't tell me much more. All he said was that the building had been around for nearly 100 years, and over the decades, there had been rumors about strange events, unexplained noises, and even reports of people feeling like they were being watched. There was even an incident years ago where someone had reported seeing a figure standing in the hallway. The manager was careful not to confirm anything, but I could tell from his demeanor that he believed there was something to the rumors. That night, I decided to do something I hadn't considered before. I called a local paranormal investigator, someone who specialized in hauntings. The investigator, a calm and patient man named Steve, agreed to come by the apartment and take a look. He arrived around 8 p.m., equipped with various tools, an electromagnetic field, EMF detector, a voice recorder, and a few other gadgets I couldn't quite understand. Steve spent the next few hours walking around the apartment, asking questions into the air and noting down any strange readings. I didn't feel any immediate difference, but when he reviewed the audio recordings, his face went pale. "Did you hear that?" he asked, pointing to the recorder. I listened, and my blood ran cold. On the recording, I could hear the soft sound of breathing, the unmistakable voice saying the words, "Help me." Steve confirmed that the readings in the apartment were off the charts. The EMF meter was picking up high levels of electromagnetic activity, which, according to him, could indicate the presence of something paranormal. "You're not imagining this," he said quietly. "There's definitely something in here." I was shaken. He told me that some spirits latch onto places lingering after traumatic events or unresolved issues. But no matter how much I pressed him, he couldn't tell me exactly what was causing it. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers continued, and the air in the apartment felt thick with something unexplainable. By the following morning, I packed up my things. I couldn't stay there any longer. I found another apartment nearby and moved out within a week. To this day, I don't know what happened in that apartment or why it felt so alive with a presence I couldn't understand. I never went back, and I've never been able to shake the feeling that something followed me. Every now and then, in the dead of night, I hear the faintest whisper in the back of my mind. "Help me." Story the end.
Story number 8.
I had never been one to believe in ghosts or supernatural occurrences. To me, those were things that belonged in movies or were just figments of an overactive imagination. But that changed in the fall of 2018 when I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. The apartment was in an older building, one that had seen better days. The walls were cracked, the paint peeling in spots, and the floors creaked, as if the building itself were tired. But it was affordable, and the landlord was a friendly older man who assured me the place was quiet and peaceful. I figured it would be a good place to start fresh after my breakup, to live alone and focus on myself. The first few weeks went by uneventfully. I settled into a routine of work, cooking simple meals, and occasionally inviting friends over. The apartment, while not glamorous, felt like home. But as the days passed, I began to feel a strange presence. It wasn't something that immediately terrified me, but it was an odd, lingering feeling that something or someone was watching me. It began one night when I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone. It was late, around 11:30 p.m., and the apartment was completely still. Suddenly I heard the faintest sound, a soft tapping. It came from the direction of the kitchen. At first, I thought it was just the pipes in the walls or the wind, but it was persistent, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. I got up and walked cautiously toward the kitchen. The tapping continued, but when I reached the doorway, it stopped. I stood there for a moment listening, but everything was silent. There was no sign of anyone or anything that could explain the noise. The clock on the wall ticked loudly and I felt a slight chill in the air, but I shrugged it off as my imagination. The next few nights, the tapping returned, always when I was lying in bed, ready to fall asleep. It started out faint, but grew louder each time. I began to feel unnerved by it, but I refused to let it control me. I tried to ignore the noise and kept convincing myself that it was simply the old building settling, that I was being paranoid. But then came the night when I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had just gotten home from work and it was around 9 p.m. I set my things down on the kitchen counter and walked to the living room where I intended to relax and watch some TV. As I sat on the couch, I heard it again, the unmistakable tapping, but this time it was different. It wasn't just from the kitchen anymore. It was coming from the hallway. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. I had lived alone since I moved in, and I hadn't invited anyone over that day. There was no one else in the apartment. I stood up slowly and walked toward the hallway. The tapping stopped abruptly as I neared the entrance, but I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. As I walked further down the hall, I glanced into the bathroom, the closet, and the spare room. Everything was as it should be, empty, untouched. But when I looked back down the hallway toward the living room, I noticed something strange. The door to my bedroom was slightly ajar. I knew I had closed it before I left. A chill ran through me, and my heart rate picked up. I hesitated, unsure of what to do, but I felt compelled to check. I walked slowly toward the bedroom door, every step echoing in the silence. When I reached the door, I pushed it open cautiously. My breath caught in my throat. The room looked the same, but the bed was slightly rumpled, as if someone had been lying there. The covers were twisted and uneven, with a noticeable dip in the center, as if someone had just gotten up. I hadn't touched the bed since I made it that morning. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe I had accidentally left the door open. Maybe the wind had moved the blankets. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I backed out of the room, my heart pounding, and closed the door behind me. I tried to push the thought out of my mind. I turned on the TV, trying to distract myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept checking the hallway, the kitchen, even the bathroom, but there was nothing there. Everything was still. That night, the tapping started again, this time louder and more insistent. It came from the living room, from the direction of the front door. I had locked the door before going to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was in the apartment with me. The noise grew louder, like someone knocking gently on the walls. I pulled the covers over my head, but the sound wouldn't stop. I could feel my pulse racing in my chest. I tried to close my eyes to sleep, but the air felt thick, heavy. It was as if the room had become suffocating. I don't know how long I lay there, terrified, waiting for the noise to stop. But then, in the stillness of the night, I heard something else. It was faint, a soft whisper that seemed to come from right beside my ear. "Help me." I shot up in bed, my heart racing. I looked around the room, but there was no one there. I couldn't breathe. I felt paralyzed, unable to move. The whisper came again, just as soft, just as pleading. "Help me." I grabbed my phone and dialed the only number I could think of, my best friend, Sarah. She answered on the second ring, her voice groggy from sleep. "Hey, what's wrong?" she asked, sounding concerned. "I need you to come over. Something's happening here and I don't know what it is. Are you okay? What's going on?" I don't know how to explain it. There's something here. I keep hearing noises, tapping, whispering. I don't feel safe. Please, just come over. I hung up before she could respond, too scared to even wait for her reply. I sat there in the dark, clutching my phone, waiting for the sounds to return. The tapping began again, this time from the corner of the room, as if someone were tapping their fingers on the wall. I felt a cold gust of air, and I shivered. The temperature in the room dropped drastically, and the whispers started again, this time louder. "Help me, please." The lights flickered, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, coming toward me. They were getting closer. My breath came in short gasps, and I felt as though I might faint from the sheer terror. But just as suddenly as the footsteps had started, they stopped. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things and bolted out of the apartment, running down the stairs and out into the street, not looking back. I didn't care if it was the middle of the night. I couldn't stay there. I waited outside for Sarah to arrive, my heart still pounding in my chest, my mind racing with questions I didn't have answers to. When Sarah showed up about 10 minutes later, she took one look at my face and immediately knew something was wrong. I told her everything, and though she was concerned, she insisted on going back to the apartment with me to see if there was any logical explanation for the strange happenings. When we entered the apartment together, the silence was deafening. There was no tapping, no whispers. Everything was as it had been before I left. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what had happened. The next day I called the landlord, but when I explained what had been happening, he was oddly dismissive. He simply told me that the building was old, that old buildings make noises, and that it was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. I didn't stay in that apartment much longer after that. I found a new place to live, a safer place where I could sleep without hearing the tapping or the whispers. But I'll never forget that feeling of being watched, of hearing those words in the dark. Help me. To this day, I don't know who or what was trying to reach out to me, but I know that something was in that apartment. Something that still lingers in my memory, a reminder that some things can't be explained. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It was the winter of 2019 when I moved into the old house on Elm Street. It wasn't much to look at, but I had recently landed a job in the small town and needed a place to stay that was within my budget. The house was cheap, even for a place in this quiet neighborhood, and the landlord seemed like a nice older gentleman. He told me the house had been around for over 100 years, but assured me there were no issues with it, nothing out of the ordinary. He said with a strange kind of emphasis that I brushed off. I didn't have any expectations when I moved in, but almost immediately, I started noticing strange things. The house was old, yes, and it made noises, creaks and groans from the floorboards and walls that were expected, the kind of noises that come with an old house settling. But there was something else too, something that didn't sit right with me. The first incident happened on the second night I spent there. I was alone, lying in bed, trying to fall asleep after a long day at work. The room was dark, save for the moonlight streaming in through the curtains. I had just turned off the light when I heard it, a soft whisper. It was faint at first, like the sound of wind rustling through the trees outside, but then it grew louder, more distinct, and I could swear I heard my name. Sarah. My name, clearly spoken by a voice that wasn't mine. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The house was completely still, no other sounds except for the creaking of the old timbers in the walls. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, I had just moved into a new place, and being alone in a new house could mess with anyone's mind. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to ignore the voice that had called me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The next night, it happened again. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone when I heard the voice. This time, it was closer, as though it were right next to me. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up, my phone slipping from my hands and falling to the floor. Sarah? The voice whispered again, this time much clearer. I jumped out of bed and flipped the light on, but the room was empty. I looked around, the air suddenly thick with tension. The door was closed and the window was locked shut. There was no way someone had come into the room without me hearing them. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breath. It didn't make sense. I was alone. There was no one here but me. But I couldn't ignore the voice. It had been real. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't know what to do. I decided to call my friend Amanda, hoping she could calm me down. She answered quickly, her voice still groggy from sleep. "Hey, what's up?" she asked, sounding concerned. "I think something's wrong with this house," I said, my voice trembling. "I keep hearing whispers. They keep calling my name." Amanda was quiet for a moment, then chuckled softly. "Sarah, it's probably just the wind or the house settling. Old houses make weird noises." "I don't know," I replied, my voice shaking. "This feels different." She promised to come over the next day, but by the time she arrived, everything seemed normal again. The house was still, the air calm. I had spent the whole night lying awake, but no more whispers came. When Amanda arrived, she listened to me and agreed that it was strange, but still tried to reassure me that it was just the quirks of an old house. She suggested I try to get some rest, and I did my best to take her advice, but the unease lingered. Over the next few weeks, I convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. I wasn't hearing voices anymore, and I chalked up the strange occurrences to the quirks of the house. It was old, after all, and old houses made noise. Maybe I had been a little too sensitive. That was until the night I woke up in a panic. It was 3 a.m. when I suddenly shot up in bed, my heart racing. I had been asleep, or at least I thought I had been, but something woke me up. My room was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the streetlights outside. My breath was shallow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was as if I had been startled awake by something in the room. I sat up and glanced around, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. And then I saw it. There, at the foot of my bed, stood a figure, a shadowy form, tall and slender, with an unsettling stillness. I could see no features, just the outline of a person standing there in the dark. My heart skipped a beat and I blinked, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But when I opened my eyes again, the figure was still there. It didn't move. It just stood there watching me. The air felt heavy, and the temperature dropped, sending a chill through my bones. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at the shadow in disbelief. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. The figure didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, tall and silent, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. Suddenly, the figure shifted, taking a step toward me. I gasped, finally breaking free of my paralysis, and scrambled out of bed. I ran out of the room, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away from that thing. My breath was ragged as I dashed down the hall and into the living room, the cold air biting at my skin. I didn't know where to go, what to do. I felt like I was losing my mind. I stayed in the living room for the rest of the night, too terrified to go back into my room. I called Amanda again, but she didn't pick up. I texted her, explaining what had happened, but all she could say was that she'd be over as soon as she could. I didn't sleep a wink. The next morning, I tried to gather my thoughts. Maybe it had been a nightmare, some kind of sleep paralysis, but I couldn't ignore the fear I had felt, the absolute certainty that something had been standing at the foot of my bed. Amanda came over that afternoon and I told her everything. This time, she didn't laugh or brush it off. She listened, nodding gravely, her face drawn with concern. She asked if I'd noticed anything unusual in the house's history or if I knew anything about its previous owners. I hadn't thought much about it before, but I agreed to look into it. That evening, I went to the local library and searched through old records. What I found made my blood run cold. The house had once belonged to a family, a husband and wife with 2 children. The wife had died unexpectedly, and the husband had left shortly afterward, abandoning the house. But what was more unsettling was what I found in the local news archives. A report of a man, the previous owner, being found dead in the house several months later. There was no mention of how he died, but the story had a strange detail. The neighbors reported hearing whispers and strange noises coming from the house in the days leading up to his death. I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was as if the house itself had a dark history, one that had been forgotten over time. I had no idea if the spirit of the man was still there, but after everything I had experienced, I couldn't deny the possibility. The whispers started again that night. This time, I didn't wait to find out what it was. I packed a bag, grabbed my things, and left the house. I found a place to stay with Amanda for the time being, and I never went back. I'm still not sure what happened in that house or why it chose me. But I know one thing for sure, I'll never get the feeling of that shadow standing at the foot of my bed, watching me in the dark. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I had always considered myself a skeptic. Ghost stories, supernatural occurrences, and strange happenings, those were things I reserved for campfire tales, movies, and books. I believed in science, logic, and rational explanations. But what happened to me in late 2017 completely shattered my perception of reality. It all began when I moved into a new apartment in a small town. I had recently graduated college and found a job as a graphic designer. The apartment was modest but comfortable. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, and a cozy living room. The building was old, probably built in the early 1900s, and while it had its share of wear and tear, it was within my budget. The landlord, an elderly woman named Mrs. Carmichael, seemed pleasant enough. She told me that the building had been in her family for generations and that there had been no issues with the tenants over the years. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. I settled into my routine of working from home, binge watching shows on Netflix, and occasionally meeting friends for dinner. The apartment was quiet, and I didn't think twice about the creaks and groans of the old building. But then, one night, something happened that I couldn't explain. It was a cold Thursday evening in October. I had just finished a late dinner and was sitting on the couch scrolling through social media when I heard a soft thud from the hallway. It was faint, but it caught my attention. I paused my phone, trying to figure out what the sound was. It sounded like something falling or being knocked over, but there was no reason for it to have happened. I lived alone, and there were no pets. The hallway was empty, and the door to my bedroom was shut tight. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just another noise from the old building. I returned to my phone, but the feeling of unease lingered in the back of my mind. A few minutes later, the noise came again, this time louder, a distinct thud followed by a dragging sound like something was being pulled along the floor. My heart began to race. I got up from the couch, walked to the hallway, and stood there for a moment, listening intently. Silence. Nothing. I took a deep breath and pushed open the bedroom door, half expecting to find something out of place. But the room was empty. The bed was neatly made and everything appeared as it should be. I tried to dismiss it as a trick of my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I went back to the living room and turned on the TV, hoping to distract myself. But as the minutes passed, I felt an increasing sense of dread, a feeling that I wasn't alone in the apartment. I glanced toward the hallway again, but there was no movement, no sounds. I tried to relax, telling myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew something had happened. Around midnight, I decided to head to bed. I turned off the lights and crawled under the covers, my mind racing. The apartment felt unnaturally quiet, almost too quiet. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the uneasy feeling in my chest. I hadn't been asleep for long when I heard it again. The faint sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate steps, like someone was walking down the hallway toward my bedroom. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps were soft but distinct, and I could hear them getting closer, one step after another. I held my breath, my body rigid with fear. The steps stopped just outside my door. I lay there, staring at the door, waiting for it to open. But it didn't. For what felt like an eternity, I lay motionless, not daring to make a sound. The room was so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. The footsteps never came again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing on the other side of the door, watching me. I finally worked up the courage to get out of bed and open the door, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. My heart was still racing, and I felt a chill in the air, but I convinced myself that it was just the wind, the old building settling. The next few days were uneventful, and I started to think I had imagined the whole thing. But then, a few nights later, it happened again. This time, the footsteps weren't the only thing I heard. As I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, I heard a faint whisper, a soft, barely audible voice. "Help me." I sat up in bed, my pulse quickening. It sounded so close, as if someone were right next to me, whispering into my ear. I glanced around the room, but it was empty. The whisper came again, this time louder. "Help me." I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran to the hallway and flicked on the light, but the apartment was still. The air felt colder now, and I could see my breath as I stood there in the middle of the hallway. I felt paralyzed, unsure of what to do. I looked around, but everything was in its place. No one was there. I decided I couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. I called my friend, Lisa, and told her what had been happening. She was skeptical at first, but she agreed to come over and stay with me for the night. When she arrived, I explained everything in detail. We checked the apartment together, but we found nothing out of the ordinary. No strange drafts, no unusual noises, just an old apartment creaking and groaning like it always did. But that night, something happened that changed everything. Around 3 a.m., we both woke up to a loud bang coming from the kitchen. It was so sudden and forceful that it made us jump out of bed in shock. We rushed to the kitchen where we found nothing. No broken dishes, no items out of place. But then Lisa pointed to the floor. There on the ground was a small object, something I didn't recognize. It was a photograph, an old faded black and white picture. I picked it up confused. The photo was of a man and a woman standing together in front of the apartment building. The woman looked familiar, but I couldn't place her face. The man beside her was holding a child, a small girl with curly hair, and they were all smiling. The back of the photo had a date written in faded ink, November 12th, 1921. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The woman in the photo was Mrs. Carmichael, my landlord. But I couldn't understand why the photo had appeared in my kitchen or how it had ended up there. I showed it to Lisa, and her face went pale. She said the man in the photo was the same person she had seen in the building when we first moved in, a man she assumed was just a maintenance worker. But the most unsettling part was that there was something else on the back of the photo, a name, written in the same ink, Elizabeth. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, and I decided I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. The whispers, the footsteps, and now this photograph, it all pointed to something I couldn't explain. The next morning, I went to speak with Mrs. Carmichael. I told her everything, from the noises to the photo. She listened quietly, her expression unreadable. When I showed her the photograph, her face softened. "That photo was taken a long time ago," she said. "It's of my grandparents. Elizabeth was my grandmother. She passed away in this apartment many years ago. She had been ill for quite some time." "Is she haunting this place?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mrs. Carmichael looked at me with a kind of sorrow in her eyes. I've heard stories, but I didn't want to believe them. She wasn't the only one to pass here. There were others too. I don't know if it's her spirit or the house itself, but there's something about this place, something that doesn't let go. I never stayed in that apartment again. I packed my things, left the key with Mrs. Carmichael, and never looked back. To this day, I don't know what I experienced, whether it was a ghost, a figment of my imagination, or something else entirely. But one thing is for sure. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the whispers in the dark, and the cold, eerie presence that lingered long after I left. Story the end.